Hi, everybody. Welcome to another JetBrains live stream. I'm really excited about today's talk and our guest. But just to kind of give you a hint, I was just looking over the JetBrains 2023 Developer Ecosystem Survey. And did you know 45% of .NET developers today still work with .NET Framework in some capacity? That's the largest group in all of .NET Dev. So today's topic is really interesting. We see chat is really lively, so I'm super excited. But before we get to our talk and our guest, I got to do some housekeeping. So on that note, YouTube chat is going right now. If you're joining us live, please engage in there. It's always a lot of fun. There's a lot of people from a lot of places from around the world. Ask your questions. I'll keep track of all those questions, and we'll ask our guest at the end of their talk some of those really, really interesting questions. So on that note, a question that comes up a lot, is this session being recorded? Of course it is. It's on YouTube. So if you need to walk away, pick up the kids, take the dog for a walk, don't worry. It's going to be on JetBrains TV. Just be sure to like and subscribe so you can know when to come back and see this good content. So on that note, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest today, Isaac Levin. Welcome to the live stream.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me, Khalid. I'm looking forward to chatting about .NET Framework apps and what do we do with them. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a good one.
Yeah. Again, folks, ask questions. Isaac, I'm going to give you the stage. I'll be over here. I'll mute myself, and the stage is yours. So good luck.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And if anybody has any questions, like Khalid mentioned, I'm looking at chat. He's looking at chat. So if you got a good question, we'll definitely go ahead and get them answered. So the topic of today's discussion is what do we do with our old .NET Framework apps? And throughout this conversation, we're going to be talking about a few things. Like we're going to talk really briefly about the history of .NET. We're going to talk about some of the different ideas or things that we can think about as we're going through the process of potentially upgrading or even thinking about upgrading our .NET Framework apps. And then also maybe we're going to look at a tool that can maybe help us get a little bit of the way there towards the end. But before I get started, I wanted to introduce myself a little bit. So if you're not familiar with who I am, my name is Isaac Levin. I'm a .NET developer advocate, Microsoft MVP. I've been a .NET developer for close to 15 years now. I looked the other day, somebody asked me like, oh, how long have you been working? And I said, oh, it's been a bit. So in my entire professional career, I've been in the .NET ecosystem. I started out building, WCF and web forms apps and in classic ASP apps, and I've kind of stuck around with .NET for the long haul. I've looked at other programming languages, I've built projects and other things, but at the end of the day, I just keep coming back to .NET because I love it so much. If you want to learn a bit more about me and see some of the stuff that I'm building or some of the stuff that I'm doing, you can reach out to me on a couple of different social media handles. I apologize for the fact that one of them is wrapped, but I think you can figure out what it's supposed to be. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Blue Sky, Twitch, YouTube, all of the different places. I also have a podcast called Coffee and Open Source where I have conversations with people all across the tech landscape about, tech, their career in tech, open source, the different things that are going on. I've had some great guests. I've had folks like Kelsey Hightower, Liz Fong Jones, Scott Hanselman. The list goes on and on. I've been doing it for a few years now. So if you like people rambling about tech for 45 minutes to an hour, please check that out. It's available wherever your podcast platform of choice is. And there's also a live version or a streamed version that happens out on YouTube. So before we get started talking about .NET apps in specific, let's do a little fun game. So I love JetBrains. I wouldn't be here if I didn't love the JetBrains products. And I hope the folks that you hear love JetBrains as well. And what I want to do today is I want to have a little bit of fun. I want to give away to one of the folks that's here watching the stream live right now a JetBrains license. Thank you to Khalid for setting that up for us. So this is how we're going to do it. So if I'm going to count down from the newest version of .NET Framework, which is .NET 4.8, and I'm going to count down lower and lower versions. And if you are a maintainer or a developer of a .NET app that's in that particular version, just type in what that version is. And as we go down, the person who is still typing in versions of the .NET Framework is going to get a JetBrains license. So, and how you can do that is you can reach out to me on Twitter, and I'll coordinate all of that for us. So let's get going. So if we are building .NET Framework 4.8 apps today, go ahead and just put it into the chat. You can say 4.8 or here or me or whatever, and we'll start counting down. There's no one in the chat. Goodness gracious. There's no one here that is maintaining .NET Framework apps today. Okay, so we got one person. Here we go. There might be a little bit of delay, I think, on the feed. So we're gonna, play with that a little bit. All right, so we're at 4.8. So what about 4.7? Is there anybody here that's doing 4.7 stuff? I already saw a couple of us. All right, and what about 4.5? Is there anybody here doing 4.5 .NET Framework development today? All right, I'm still seeing a lot of 4.7s. Oh, I see a good one. Somebody is skipping ahead. So we're 4.7, 4.5. How about 4.0? And then we're going to go 3.5 and 3.0. So if anybody today has a 3.0 .NET Framework application that they actually maintain, not just that they built 4 or 5 years ago and they don't work on that project anymore, but they actively have to maintain it. All right, so I see a .NET Framework 3.5. Okay, what about 3.0?
Ooh, Jesse.
Oh, I see a 3.1. Somebody did a 2.1 earlier, so I think that person might be taking it. What about 2.1 or 2.0? Is anybody doing, they were super excited, 2.0. I think that's when generics came out. Which, I mean, that's absolutely wild to think about building .NET apps for generics.
Yeah, array list.
Yeah, array list, right? Yeah, okay, so we got a 2.0. Does anybody have a .NET Framework today that they're maintaining that's under 2.0? 2.0, okay. All right, so we got a couple people that are at 2.0. What about 1.1? Because that was the first .NET app that I actually had to maintain, was a 1.1 app. And it was wild. I had to remote into a VM because it was like Windows 98 on there. It's absolutely crazy. All right, so no one is below 2.0, so it looks like. So it looks like we have 2 people that are 2.0. And what I'm going to do then is we're going to do a quick raffle between the 2 people on chat that put in 2.0. We're going to do this. What is the newest version of .NET that you have built an app that is in production today? All right, so somebody did put in .NET 1.1. So actually let's skip that. So the individual who put .NET 1.1, if you want to reach out to me on Twitter at Isaac R. Levin, you can reach out to me on Twitter there, and we'll make sure that we get you a copy of JetBrains. So I'm looking forward to hearing the cool things that you're going to be building with JetBrains products, once you get that license. So again, reach out to me on Twitter if we want to move forward. All right. So that was fun, right? So we learned a little bit about, there's a lot of people that are building .NET Framework apps here. So I'm hoping that this conversation can, be really thoughtful in talking about ways that we can kind of make the life of the .NET developer a bit better. All righty. So let's start off with talking a little bit about where we are today. So if you haven't been familiar or paying attention to what's been going on with .NET over the last 5 or 6 years, like .NET is a thriving ecosystem with all sorts of great, amazing experiences that folks can build in. So if you've been building .NET frameworks and maybe you've heard of, .NET Core, .NET 5, 6, 7, 8, let's talk a little bit about what .NET 8 can actually bring to you if you're a .NET framework developer. So now there's a single SDK, there's one base class library, and it's a unified tool chain all the way through, meaning that you can build cross-platform apps like Linux apps, Mac OS apps, Tizen apps if you have Samsung smart TVs. You can build those UIs whether they're running on those different platforms or if they're running in different clouds, which is super exciting. And also .NET is based on, if you follow any of like the .NET celebrities on the internet, they talk about performance and productivity improvements, right? So .NET is probably, in my opinion, the most efficient language that you can build things at scale today. So it's crazy to think that we've gone from .NET Framework, which is 20 plus years in the making of software development, to now we can kind of build apps that are super small that run everywhere, which I think is really, really awesome. But let's talk about how we got to this point, right? So there's this idea of one .NET. So if you're paying attention in here today, you're probably familiar with the top box that's on the left here. So .NET Framework. So again, .NET Framework, like I mentioned, it's like 22 years old, I think, to date, which is absolutely crazy to think about. And it's Windows only. You build applications that run specifically on the Windows platform. And that was going along well. Tons of enterprises have built their solutions and built their tech stacks on top of .NET Framework. But during this time, there was also a handful of community folks that loved writing apps in C#, loved building .NET apps, but they wanted to be able to run those apps in non-Windows environments. So like Unix, Linux environments, Mac OS. And that, they spun up a project. And that project was called the Mono Runtime, or the Mono Project. And basically what the idea was is we're going to kind of reverse engineer the .NET Framework and write some of the underlying libraries to actually run on Linux and run on Mac. The folks that kind of put together that project, they spun up a company called Xamarin, and that company was building mobile apps and mobile app toolkits and things like that. Microsoft sees, the .NET team sees, hey, we're seeing all of this traction for folks that want to build .NET apps not on Windows. So they start to put together a Linux or a non-Windows version of .NET and call it .NET Core. And that comes out, I think, 2017 or so. I have to, please hold me honest with the dates here. So, what happens at this particular point in time, right? So we have these three versions of .NET. Microsoft owns two of them. And then Microsoft acquires Xamarin, which Microsoft now owns three different implementations of .NET. So what do we do when we have three things that do more or less the same thing? We combine them together to make a new version of .NET. And it brings all of the learnings from, .NET Framework, all the learnings from the Mono project, as well as all the learnings from .NET Core to provide great experiences for folks around .NET development. And if you're building, VB apps, F# apps, or C# apps, you can do all those things with one unified toolchain. So what does it actually mean today? So it means that if you are on .NET Framework, you have options. It's funny because this talk is like, what do we do with our old .NET apps? If they're on the latest versions of .NET Framework, which is 4.8, at the time of this of our stream here, it means that you have support. It means that you can stay on .NET Framework 4.8 or 4.8.x when new security patches come out forever. And throw in the chat, I want people to kind of give me some ideas as to why they think .NET Framework will have basically support forever. I'd love to hear what some of the folks are thinking. And while some of the folks are putting that in there, I'm just going to kind of glance on it, and we're going to talk a little bit about, some of the other things. So, like I mentioned, this cross-platform implementation of .NET called .NET Core, the idea is that, we would just build versions of it. So .NET Core 1, .NET Core 2, .NET Core 3, and in the last version of .NET Core was 3.1. But we still kind of had this mono runtime, this great thing that was being built by the community, and was kind of gave us a lot of interesting things like ahead of time compilation, tree shaking, a lot of things that weren't built into .NET Core. And the thought was, okay, so what should we do at this point in time? Like, we have all these versions, we should probably look to kind of consolidate them. So for the folks I'm reading the chat here, so, the number one reason why we're on .NET Framework 4.8 and we can actually stay on .NET Framework 4.8 is because .NET Framework ships in Windows. So as long as there's a version of Windows, you're going to have support for .NET Framework. So, but that doesn't mean you're going to have support for .NET Framework 3.5 or 4.0. It has to be .NET Framework 4.8. You're always going to get like there's no new features, but you're going to get bug fixes. You're going to get the latest security patches. You're going to have, a secure experience building apps going forward with .NET Framework. But the important thing to call out is that there's no new features, and you have to be on the latest versions of .NET 4.8. So it's important to call that out. So we have these three versions of .NET, these three implementations of .NET. We have .NET Framework, we have .NET Core, and we have the mono runtime. So when we decided when the .NET team decided, okay, we're going to go to the next version of .NET Core, which is, we're on 3.1, and we can call it .NET Core 4.0. And I'd love to hear in chat, like, why you think that's probably not the best idea. I think the number one reason probably is because there is a .NET Framework 4, and people shorthand search for it, .NET 4X. So how do I, loop through an array of strings and take and reverse it? And if anybody does any sort of Google or Stack Overflow search and they search .NET 4, they can get stuff from .NET Framework, which, 10, 15 years ago, or they might get something for .NET Core 4. So the idea is that's not the best experience for our end users. So let's do something interesting. Let's take some of the learnings that we've built, the learnings that have been built by the mono runtime, the folks there, and let's merge that into .NET Core. And that's what happened in .NET 5, which came out a handful of years ago. And at that point in time, we just continued to iterate on it. More and more things from mono were merged into .NET 6. And now we're at .NET 7, which came out last year. And then November of 2023, we had .NET 8 come out. And let's talk a little bit about .NET versions, right? So you've noticed that there's 8 and 7 and 6, and there's numbers here, right? So if you have, the goal of .NET is to ship a version of .NET every single year, which typically happens at .NET Conf, which is the .NET Developer Conference that is around November of every year. So November of every year, until we're told otherwise, there's going to be a new version of .NET, and the latest version, like I said, just came out, which is .NET 8. But the numbers mean something really important. So every even number, so .NET 8, .NET 6, those are what's called LTS, or long-term support versions of .NET, which means that you have 3 years from release of support. So doing the math from November of 2023, so to the end of 2026, you'll have support for .NET 8. What does the odd numbers mean? The odd numbers mean STS, which stands for standard term support, which is 18 months. So for instance, here's an example. .NET 7 was released in November of 2022. 18 months from that is May of 2024. So for May of this year, we are going to run out of support for .NET 7. But we have .NET 8, and the migration path is really, really straightforward now. It's not extremely painful for a lot of use cases. So you have the ability to go from 7 to 8 pretty quickly. And if you built an app in .NET 6, you still have 3 years of support from there. So that was November of 2021. So November of 2024. So this year coming up is when we'll run out of support for .NET 6. So you have tons of time to get from .NET 6 to .NET 8 and stay in support. I hope that makes a ton of sense. I know I was throwing a lot of dates and numbers and all of that, but it's important to call out kind of what the support policy looks like for .NET and how we got to this point where, we went from, we were talking about .NET Framework 4, somebody on the chat, 1.1, right? And now we're at 8, and it's 20 years of development to get there. So the most important thing to talk about is what is not in the latest versions of .NET in .NET 8. So there are a couple of things on this list that you might be familiar about, right? So for instance, if you're building web forms apps or WCF server apps, like there isn't going to be an official version of those platforms or those components inside of .NET 8. But, the .NET team does have some recommendations as to, what are some suitable .NET 8 replacements, ASP.NET Core replacements that can meet you part of the way there. And if you're building a web forms app, and I highly recommend you take a look at ASP.NET Blazor, ASP.NET Core Blazor. And what's interesting about it is that it follows a similar programming pattern, like the page controller pattern, which kind of gives us the ability to have like a front end and quote unquote a back end where we have like where we can write our C# code, and that's kind of mirrored with our presentation layer. And that's really, really valuable. And there's tons of awesome things you can do with Blazor. If you haven't played around with it, I highly recommend you do it. It gives you the ability to build like amazing Web 2.0, like JavaScript rich experiences in the browser, all in C#, which I think is really awesome. And you can still interop into JavaScript if you need to. If you're building WCF apps, there's a couple of options that I think are pretty interesting. One option is that you can go with like the .NET team official supported like replacement, which is gRPC, which is a different way of sending data across the wire to servers. Yeah, it uses if you're building a WCF app, you can use XML or JSON to send that. Or if you're using Web API, you can use JSON, right? With gRPC, it actually sends byte data. So it's actually binary data. So it's actually faster, up to 12 times faster to send those, make that communication over something like XML or JSON. So if speed and performance is really, really important to you, gRPC might be an interesting option. If you like building apps in like the WCF model, right? Like if you like bindings, if you like all of those sort of contracts and addresses and those sort of things, there's an open source community project where it's a .NET Core implementation of WCF, and it's called Core WCF. It's gotten contributors from Microsoft and a bunch of other folks in the .NET community. So I highly recommend, if you like building WCF apps, but you want to get to the latest version of .NET, take a look at Core WCF. So I think it's really, really important to call that out. So let's talk a little bit about, as it pertains to like framework names, because I think one of the things that's really important when we're talking about building apps today is that they can run in a bunch of different places. .NET Framework, there's one place those apps run, and it was on Windows, whether it's a Windows server with IIS or a Windows desktop client, right? But now, since we have apps that can basically run anywhere, like I was talking about earlier, you need to think about what kind of platforms you're building for. And how, the .NET team has solved this is kind of thinking about framework names and simplifying that entire approach. So when we talk about framework names, we talk about the version of .NET that we're trying to run. So for instance, in .NET 8, so this is code that runs everywhere. So it combines and replaces the latest of .NET Core App, which is .NET Core 3.1, and .NET Standard, which is .NET Standard, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It takes everything from those namespaces and puts them in there. And if you want to build apps that run on particular platforms like Windows or Android, iOS, Tizen, the browser with WASM, you would do that by providing what's called a TFM, or a target framework moniker. So which is basically your target framework dash whatever your platform is. So what those monikers do is it lights up specific OS functionality on top of the .NET 8 base experience. And, just because I love pictures, here's kind of like a graphical representation of that. So when we talk about .NET 8.0, it's that X.Y experience, which, .NET Core App 3.1 and .NET Standard 2.1 is inside of that collection of things. And then if you need to abstract and go up one level to a specific platform, you can do dash Windows or dash Android or dash what have you. So I hope that makes sense. And I think the big thing to call out there is that this is substantially simpler from a versioning perspective too when we're building our apps. And you can actually take a look at these things. If you open up a new .NET 8 project today, you can actually double click on the project, which you can't do with .NET Framework apps, and it'll actually open up the project file, which is in a new format, which is a bit more readable and cleaner, to be honest. And it'll say target framework, it'll say .NET 8.0 or what have you. So important to call out. So the question becomes, when Microsoft is building libraries, what libraries will those, what frameworks will those libraries target? So if they're building, if it's an application or a framework that's going to, or a library that's going to be used by ASP.NET Core, Entity Framework Core, everything in like the system dot namespace, or all those packages, most libraries are going to be .NET 8.0. And if they're building apps that are running specific, or libraries run specific on Windows, like whether it's WinForms or WPF, and in some cases manage UWP controls, the TFM for that is .NET 8.0-Windows. And if they're building like cross-platform stuff, so Xamarin Essentials or Xamarin Forms or .NET MAUI or other cross-platform extractions, it's going to be .NET 8.0-whatever that TFM is, iOS, Android, what have you. And then finally, if you need to build apps that are libraries that are still referenced by .NET Framework applications, like good examples are Microsoft Data.SQL client and packages that need support for .NET Framework, the target framework there is .NET Standard 2.0. And, let's talk a little bit about .NET Standard for a second, because the question becomes like, what should you target if you're building a library today? So if you're building a library that needs to take advantage of, or needs to be, consumed by a new .NET 8 app or a .NET Framework app, you can take advantage of .NET Standard. And what .NET Standard is, it's a contract of all of the, cross-platform APIs. So think of it like this. If you have a particular version of .NET Standard, it supports X amount of APIs. And when I mean APIs, I mean like systems.collection.generic or systems.link, or those are APIs, right? And what .NET Standard does is, based on a particular version of .NET Standard, it supports a particular version of particular platforms. So here's an example. So the larger the number, the more APIs you have access to, but the less platforms you can deploy to. So an example being, if you were to compare .NET Standard 1.6 and 2.0, .NET Standard 2.0 has more APIs, but it supports less platforms. 1.6, for instance, like Windows 8 and some other things like that. So the question becomes like, okay, well, why should I use Standard 1.6 versus Standard 2.0? It depends on what kind of .NET Framework app that you're building that needs to use those libraries. Hopefully that makes sense. But if you're, there are some other things too. There's not Standard 2.0. It was like the last like big version of .NET Standard. There's a .NET Standard 2.1, which allows you to share some code between the model runtime and Xamarin and some .NET Core 3.x things. But when you're building like .NET 7 and .NET 8 apps, it's less important. There are some interesting things in there like spanf, which allows you to kind of get, a lower level down from like a memory allocation standpoint. But if at the end of the day, the number one question is, if you're building something that's going to be used only by new apps, just use .NET 8 for that library. So you can build a class library in .NET 8 today without issue. So we've been talking for like 20 minutes, right? And I just kind of gave a history lesson of .NET and what is and what isn't included in the latest versions of .NET. And I haven't talked at all about like, what do we do when we build our .NET, when we want to upgrade our .NET Framework apps? And when I talk to folks, I tend to think of things as, there's a typical workflow that exists when we're building apps today or we're upgrading apps today. And I think the number one thing that's most important is preparation. So if think about it like this. If all of a sudden today you decided, hey, I'm going to upgrade our .NET Framework 3.5 app to .NET 6 or .NET 7, and I just go in there and I start updating stuff, like updating the project file or updating the class names and all of that, I'm probably going to be stressed out immediately, right? What's a better approach is to do it like an inventory. Like there are tools out there that allow you to, inspect your solutions, inspect your projects to come out with like, hey, like these are all the things that if I went forward with an upgrade that I would have to upgrade. And once you have that list, you can actually go to your manager and say, hey, like, these are all these deprecated, or these are all of these like out of support dependencies that we have. Like we should really look to upgrade to the latest versions of .NET. And, hopefully your boss is an empathetic person and will help you out by saying, yes, I agree, we should move forward with that sort of thing, which is really, really important. The next thing, which, after you kind of have gotten the green light or made the decision to upgrade, there are some tools that can help you do that, and we'll take a look at one of them. So there's an upgrade assistant, which is a cross-platform CLI tool that allows you to kind of go through the process of analyzing and upgrading. So when you go through that upgrade process, like the first thing that's probably going to happen is your code isn't going to work, right? So the biggest thing is opening it up in Visual Studio, opening it up in JetBrains Writer, taking a look at, what some of the things that you're building, and, try to fix your code. And I think the most important thing is that when we go from like step 3 to step 2, I want people to throw into chat, like, what should I do like before I actually start step 2? Like, what's the number one thing that will probably save me in the future from having to, pull my hair out? I don't have much hair, but anybody have any thoughts? Khalid, do you have any thoughts? What's the number one thing you should do before you start an upgrade?
Definitely make sure you commit and have source control. I'll say that.
Yeah. So like spin up a new branch, right? Because I think the last thing that you want is like, you're like 5% into an upgrade and your project doesn't build. And then your boss is like, hey, there's work for you to do. Like, can you ship this feature? I can't because my solution doesn't build locally. Like that's going to be a great conversation for you to have. I highly recommend you do not have that conversation. But once you've gotten to the point where you've upgraded a lot of the primitives of your project, and you've gotten to the point where your code, it builds, then you start that test process, right? You run it locally. You test it out by deploying it to other environments. If you have users test, you could take advantage of some really cool DevOps stuff like blue-green deployments or feature flags or what have you to, make sure that not everybody gets the version if you don't want everybody to get the version at once. And, once you validate that everything tests and works, like you're great. You've upgraded your .NET app. And I think, one of the things that I've always, when I kind of talk through this workflow of people, it's compartmentalizing the primary pieces that we need to do going through this process. At the end of the day, it's really, really important that thinking about it in little boxes. If we try to do everything at once, we're going to make ourselves absolutely crazy. But if we say, okay, I do the preparation step. All right, well, the preparation step, that wasn't too challenging. I can then take a break for 6 months because the preparation step is done. You have the ability to control your own experience, right? Instead of just starting, running, trying to jump out of a car that's going 60 miles an hour, right? It's better to build up that. So that's the typical workflow. And I think it's really, really important to think about. The question then becomes okay, so what do I rewrite versus what I reuse? And this is the most interesting conversation that I have, because a lot of people don't realize that most of the code that they write, most of the code that's primary to the app success is code that's probably reusable. So if you have business logic, if you're accessing data in particular ways, if you're using dependency injection, your container configuration with Ninject or AutoFac or something like that, you can more likely reuse a lot of that. Third-party dependencies, most third-party, major open source maintainers, they've bit the bullet and they've kind of come out with versions of their libraries that support the latest versions of .NET. So it's just a matter of getting to those third-party dependencies. If you're building ASP.NET MVC apps, models, views, and controllers are still the same in ASP.NET Core. There are some changes you'll need to make, but most of that primary plumbing is going to be reusable to an extent. And what I recommend is when you do the upgrades part, start taking pieces of your code that are reusable and move them into class libraries. Move them out of the web project or what have you, the WCF project. And once you get to a particular point in time, the code that needs to be rewritten is the only code that you have left in that project. And some of the examples of that, if you're doing some stuff in global ASCX or the app start or things like that, you have some interesting routing or configuration using configuration manager. You're using HTTP modules or bundling and minification, or if you're using those different component types, like I mentioned earlier, that's stuff that you're going to rewrite. But more than likely, a lot of the code that you have written by hand yourself is reusable. So that's important to call out, because at the end of the day, we want to reuse as much of that code as possible, because it's going to make our life a bit easier, and it's going to make our sell easier when we talk about actually going through the process of doing the upgrade. So I mentioned there's a couple of tools. One tool I wanted to talk about really quickly is the .NET Upgrade Assistant, which is a CLI-based tool that allows you to analyze and upgrade .NET Framework projects, and it supports MVC, it supports WinForms and console apps and class libraries, and it's pretty valuable, and it gets us a lot of the way there when it comes to upgrading our .NET apps. It's not going to literally do all of it for us, because more than likely there'll be some changes that we need to make ourselves, but it can do a lot of the deal with the low-hanging fruit that exists, so we don't have to actually go down the path of doing some of these crazy things and doing a bunch of research as okay, what TFM should I use, or what versions of these NuGet packages should I look out for? These are some of the things that are that the CLI tool can help us with. And I think it's really, really an interesting time. Let's just go through and start a demo really quick. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Fleet, which is this really, really cool tool that JetBrains has built that allows us to kind of edit files on the fly and do all sorts of stuff. And I'm going to use it to kind of take a look at our Git history. So as you can take a look here, I have a matching game project, which is a solution with 2 projects in it. And there's a WinForms application, and then there's a class library logic app. So if our logic project. So if I open up this matching game.cs project, you can see here, like it's a WinExable, it's version 4.5 of the .NET framework, and it's like that old like CS proj, right? And if I take a look at the logic version, open this up, same thing, right? So it's got a lot of stuff in here. Like, honestly, I've been a .NET developer for like 15 years, and I don't know what 95% of this stuff is. But there's, version 4.5 is your target framework here. So what I want to be able to do, and let me just close this really quick. What I want to be able to do is I want to spin up the command line, and I want to run the .NET CLI or the upgrade assistant CLI to be able to go through the process of upgrading our app. And like I mentioned, it's a CLI tool. It's a .NET global tool, so you can install it. And inside of here, like I mentioned, I'm in my matching game solution, right? So I have those two projects, and I have the solution file. So if I do like upgrade assistant upgrade, and then let's just not do Newtonsoft, let's do this matching game.sln. What this is going to do is it's going to spin up an interactive experience that's going to walk me through the process of upgrading my app slowly but surely. So let's just start it. So it's going to tell us, interested in your feedback, blah, blah, blah. It gives us some information about where Visual Studio is installed, right? For instance, right now I'm using the 7.0 version of the .NET SDK. So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to want to set an entry point. So let's just click that. So we're going to apply that. So it says, please select the project you want to start. So let's just go with the matching game, which is our WinForms application, right? So that's going to say, okay, select the project to upgrade. So let's do that. And then this is really interesting because it actually says that's probably not the best order in which you should upgrade your projects. So here's the recommended order to upgrade. And the reason why that is because we have a WinForms project that's taking advantage of a class library. If we were to upgrade the WinForms project first, our app wouldn't build. Right, we'd be having a .NET 8 app, calling up against a .NET Framework 4.5 class library, and that's probably not going to work. So let's just go ahead and go with the recommended approach, and let's just start with the logic one. So we're going to do that, and then it's going to give us a list of all of the things. Can I actually zoom in? Oh, yeah. So it's going to go through and it's going to show us all the things that it's going to do as it pertains to this actual upgrade. So it's going to clean up our NuGet packages. It's going to upgrade that TFM. It's going to look at NuGet packages and maybe in some cases might apply some source code. So, but the first thing it wants to do is it wants to back up your project. And I never back up projects because I only live once. So I'm just not going to do that. So we're going to skip over our project. And the next thing it wants to do is it wants to convert our project to that SDK style. So you remember when I mentioned that the new version of .NET projects, the project file is a bit different. So it uses a more SDK style approach than like that long belabored CS project. So I can actually open up Fleet and take a look at what the difference is between the two. So I can go into my Git history here. Let me just minimize some stuff. All right, let's open that up. So if you look here, it shows me the two different things. So on the left-hand side is what my old project used to look like. And on the right-hand side is what my new project looks like. So it went from 49 lines to 11 lines. Like right now, like this doesn't build because we're not all the way done, but it shows you like how simpler the new project format is, right? So that's pretty cool. So let's close that out and let's minimize. And then the next step that it wants to do is it will actually go through the process of, cleaning up NuGet package references. And how it does this with analyzers. So analyzers are these cool things that in the latest versions of .NET allows you to basically run code checking or look for certain use cases in code and actually, report on them. So what it wants to do is it wants to add the upgrade assistant reference analyzer, which is going to help us during the process of upgrading our app. So it does that. And then it takes a look and adds some more reference analyzers for like Windows compatibility pack or Newtonsoft.json references. And then the next thing is like the big one where it's actually going to update that TFM. So in this particular case, it says, okay, it's going to update the TFM to .NET Standard 2.0, which I think is really, really interesting because it's a class library and it was a 4.5 class library, but it recognizes, hey, your class library is still referenced by a WinForms 4.5 application. So it can't be a .NET 8 or .NET 7 project. It has to be .NET Standard to still have that reverse compatibility, which I think is awesome. We can actually take a look at that. Let me open up Fleet again and go into Git, open that up. And as you can see here, it now says Net Standard 2.0, which I think is really, really cool. So closing that out. And the next thing that it wants to do is it skips through everything and moves on to the next project, because we just had a pretty simple project that wasn't doing a bunch of crazy stuff. So we can actually move forward and finalize that project. And we'll do that. And then the next thing, it says, okay, let's move on to that WinForms project. So let's start off with this. All right, click enter. And then again, it's the same thing as earlier, except now it's a WinForms project. So there's probably going to be some more things that it has to do. We'll skip over backing up, because why would you ever want to back up something? And then we're going to convert to that project style SDK. We're going to take a look at what the difference is in a second, but let's actually run some of the analyzers and other things before we actually take a look at what that difference is. All right, so it's going to add that upgrade reference analyzer. And then the next thing is going to update the TFM. So it recommends Windows TFM Net 7.0-Windows, because that's the latest version of .NET that I have on this machine. So because the project either has Windows-specific dependencies or builds to a WinXE, so it does that update for us. Let me just open up Fleet again. Open that up. Look at the Git history. And then open up this. So as you can see here on the left-hand side is the old version, which scroll, 89 lines, and the new version has 19 lines. And as you can see here, if I go up to the top, the target framework is that new TFM format, which is Net 7.0-Windows. So let's close out of here. All right, minimize. And then we're going to move along and move on to these next steps. So then it's going to look at our Windows compatibility, because the new versions of Windows require things like high DPI and some other things that if we built a WinForms application in 4.5, we didn't have to actually think about. So now it's going to basically check for some of those things. And if it needs to, it might update. It might add some different packages. It might actually update some source code. We might take a look at some of that. So if it wants to, we can actually take a look at upgrading from core WCF to course WCF. In this case, we're not needing that. It's going to add that default font API alert, because that's something that's required for newer versions of Windows. It's going to apply the WinForms source updater, which allows us to get access to things like app config, app manifest, high DPI warnings, things like that. And then if we go through here, we're going to update any app config files that exist, if they do exist. And then finally, like the last thing, which is the most interesting, is it updates our source code. So it applies a fix for this particular warning, as well. So what we can do here is it's finished. So we can finalize the upgrade and we're done. So let's actually open up Fleet and take a look at all the changes that were made. So we'll open this up again, last time, folks, and move this out of the way. So as you can see here, it updated only a handful of files. So it updated again, like that project file. So project file, again, substantially smaller, went from 89 lines to about 20 lines or so. It updated the CS project for the logic project, which went from 49 to 14. Awesome. And then finally, like, it actually went through and updated our source code. So in this particular case, where's my scroll bar? So scroll here. I don't know where my scroll bar is. It's not showing up because of weird things, but let's just open this up. Files, matching game, and then we could look in here. It was in the designer, which it was in program.cs. There we go. Program.cs. So as you can see here, it added that high DPI mode, system aware, which is required for some WinForms applications to run in .NET 8. So that's really, really cool. So I just upgraded a .NET app from .NET 4.5 to .NET 7. What do you think is going to happen if I actually go into the project and actually do a .NET run here, which is just basically kicking off the .NET CLI to run the project? Do you think it's going to work? Do you think it's going to fail miserably? What do you think is going to happen? So if I run .NET run here and it opened up in a different window, obviously, but as you can look, I have a .NET 8, a .NET 7 application running. It's a WinForms app, and I was able to upgrade it from .NET 4.5 to .NET 7 using the upgrade assistant, which I think is really, really cool. And, there's some other cool things that you can do too. Like I've done a demo in the past where I've taken an older version of newtonsoft.json.net and upgraded that and used it in a .NET 7 or .NET 8 application. And that was really, really valuable. And, so I think, going back to the slides and wrapping up as, I finish up here, I want to thank everybody. I'd love for folks to throw some questions into chat if they have any. Khalid, if you want to, maybe you've been collecting them as I've been going. If anybody wants to see some of the things I've shown here, like, if you want to look through the slide deck, this link to the slide deck that I have here, The .NET Upgrade Assistant CLI, like the GitHub repository for that, is in this short link, as well as some interesting white papers that I've seen and I've collected over the years around upgrading and modernizing .NET apps. So, that's me. That's Isaac Levin talking about upgrading .NET Framework apps. And I would love, if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out. And you can either reach out and put them in chat here, or you can reach out to me on Twitter or all the different social media platforms. So that's it for me. Let's see if there's any questions, Khalid.
Yeah, I mean, the first really big discussion that I saw in chat was really around .NET Standard, right? So maybe during the time frame between .NET Core 1 and .NET Core, let's just say 3.
Sure.
.NET Standard was like highly promoted as kind of the way to create these kind of like shareable libraries. But what has since happened to .NET Standard? It seems like there's a lot of confusion in chat about like what has happened there. So
yeah, so if you follow along with the messaging from the .NET team, most notably Immo Landwert, who's the kind of, he was the original PM for .NET Standard. He's on like the core libraries team on the .NET team. And he's come out, he said like, so there are going like .NET Standard for the most part is basically, it's run its course. It's done what it's needed to do. The goal of it was to get us to a point, when we were in the like the beginning versions of .NET Core, like there was still like a lot of APIs that folks didn't have access to, in all these things, right? And people were building lots and lots of apps that, like, as they bridged from .NET Framework apps to like modern .NET apps, .NET Core and .NET whatever, they needed like some shim, some mechanism to be able to like build libraries, and that's what .NET Standard was for. I think we're at a point now where if you're building new apps, like take advantage of building class libraries in .NET 8, the presentation app, like whether it's a Blazor app or a WPF app or a Maui app in .NET 8, and just don't use .NET Standard at all. If you still need .NET Standard, you can still use it. It's not going away. There's just not going to be like new versions of it. And it's not going to be like heavily like, I guess, marketed, I guess is the best way to phrase, because it's out there. The GitHub repository is there. I believe there's not going to be any more coding commits to it, because all of the APIs that they determined were like, these are APIs that need to be shared between these two different frameworks. They've all been identified, and they've either been ported, or in some cases they can't be ported. And that's in the case when I mentioned like use an older version of .NET Standard if you need access to this particular API.
Yeah, I think it's also good to, like, to your point, like, look back at history, right? Like .NET Core started really kind of like cloud native. Like that was the big push at the time. So the APIs were scarce. We're like way past that point now. So it's like .NET Standard, like you said, has completely run its course, and for the most part is not really the future of .NET. Like .NET runtimes and target frameworks are kind of the future. So yeah, great answer. Another question, Brains. I'm going to show this question so you can see it. Okay. Any tips for outdated libraries that might not have a similar counterpart or would be a pain to migrate to?
Yeah, I do know there's a handful of like some very heavily used .NET Framework projects that are like on GitHub or whatever that, the maintainer for whatever reason completely justified was like, I'm not going to make the effort to migrate this to .NET, because maybe they built maybe they, the newer versions of .NET had a similar experience built into the framework. Maybe, there were some Windows dependencies. I think the biggest thing is like, it depends on what you're actually trying to solve. I think, obviously porting some projects is easier than others. Like, for instance, if you have a project for whatever reason, like accesses the registry, like that project is always going to be like not like it's always going to be .NET Framework, right? So I think it really depends on what your use case is. I've run across a few. Like, I think the big one is like Bounce Castle is like the big one that I've seen that's like, that's .NET Framework, but there's a particular reason why that's .NET Framework, and it wasn't upgraded to .NET Core, .NET 7, 8, whatever. I mean, I can't think of one off the top of my head that's like, oh my gosh, like I wish like the maintainer actually ported this. But like, if you have a particular example in mind, feel free to reach out to me, or you can throw it back in chat, right? Like the biggest thing is like, I think now we're at a point where we have opinionated projects for everything. So like, depending on like what you're building, if like, let's just take logging for an example. There's like 4 or 5 like big different providers for logging that exist today, right? If you're a .NET developer, there's Serialog, there's Log4net, there's Nlog, and then you can take advantage of like the iLogging experience that's inside of .NET today, right? Like, you need to weigh out like, is this provide the feature set that that's available to me, or do I see a situation where no additional features that I look to implement would be missing here? You're kind of seeing this a little bit now, like, we're talking about messaging a lot in the .NET community. I think the big thing is like, everybody's got an opinion on like their solution on solving a particular problem. And I think the one that's the most important thing is to find the solution that aligns closest with what you believe to be accurate. Everybody's right? Like, that's the great thing about opinions, is that they're all, for the most part, right. So I think it's important to call that out specifically.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, context is always important. Like, Isaac and I are just heads on the internet, so we don't know your context, right? Like, you're ultimately going to be able to make those decisions for yourself and your team. What's interesting? I've seen enterprise library mentioned a lot, so Isaac and I can definitely start feeling our age right now when I see patterns in practice enterprise library mentioned. Those are probably ones you don't really want to port, but I don't know, maybe you do. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also it boils back to like, what are you trying to solve, right? Like, if you have a .NET Framework app today and you're taking advantage of enterprise library, I'd imagine that like that is not the preferred way to do things today, right? Like, that's the great thing about old tech, is that like, 6 months later, it's like the worst way to do things, right? Like, I look at code that I wrote like a year ago and I'm like, oh, this is terrible. Like, do I spend like the X amount of time to like rewrite my bad code, or do I just be okay with it being not the greatest, right? So I think that's the most important thing, is like, there might be, more than likely, another thing that I didn't mention is like, maybe the library that you're referencing, like, maybe it was using some constructs that are like not good anymore. Like, we talk about web forms a lot, right? Like, web forms, like, amazing, easiest way to write a web app today, in my opinion. Like, web forms is super easy, but like, it takes advantage of some things that, we found out now is not the best way to build web apps, right? Yeah. Like, sending state around and just assuming state is always there, and, just tossing objects back and forth, willy-nilly, like, that we found out through trial and error that like, there's better ways to build resilient web apps today, right?
Yeah. View state is definitely one of those things that's like a nice dev experience, but maybe not the best user experience.
Yes, very much so.
Yep. I see Sharp 83, my birth year. So I'm guessing we're around the same age. But what are some things that aren't handled by this kind of upgrade assistant? Could you share a unique example and some general strategies on just upgrading in general?
Yeah.
So if folks don't have access to that tool.
Yeah. So like the CLI tool, like it kind of, to be fair, it hits a lot of the easy cases for you, right? So like MVC, I talked about MVC a bit, right? Like, if you compare like a new .NET app and like a .NET 4.5 MVC app, like, a lot of the things, the folder structure probably looks the same. A lot of the code looks similar. Like, sure, like some APIs are a bit different, or some namespaces might be a bit different, but like, the structure of the code is the same. So like, the question about what is the upgrade system, like, what does and doesn't it do? So like, it's going to handle things like console apps, or library class libraries, or MVC. It does do like it does attempt to do a port from WCF to WCF core in that particular case. I've heard rumblings of experiments around web forms to Blazor. But the primary question is like, what can't it do? And I think the most important thing is the things that it can't do are the things that only you can do, right? So I think that's the most important thing, is like, none of these tools are here to replace anybody. Like, they're there to make sure you're able to focus on the work that only you can do. Like, you're a domain expert, you know the inner workings of why this app does this particular thing, and you can make those changes. But like, converting like the project file from like the really archaic way to like the new way, like I mentioned, I've been a .NET developer for a long time, and I don't think I ever actually like looked at an old CS project and like tried to figure out everything that it did. But again, like I'm not the best .NET developer. Some people are probably experts. A lot of people are probably experts, but I just never had to learn that. So like, why would I go down the process of like learning when a tool can do it for me?
Yeah, good, really good answer. I mean, you know, the thing that I think probably people are thinking about, especially in the chat, is just like, what kind of strategy can you put in place to upgrade, right? Like, maybe folks have a huge monolith. Let's face it, we're kind of in the enterprise, right? So we have huge monoliths. Like, how do we build a strategy to maybe upgrade so that it doesn't take 2 years to get through an upgrade? Maybe we can do it incrementally, and then before you know it, after 2 years, you've upgraded, but you haven't slowed down kind of your feature delivery for your business stakeholders.
Yeah, no, it's totally valid. And like, for what it's worth, like I did this talk at a conference, and a very enterprise heavy conference. And some guy walked up to me and he's like, I didn't want to bring this up like during your talk, but like I have a .NET framework solution that has 97 projects in it, and they're all .NET framework, right? And like his whole thing was like, how do I even go about starting? Right. And I think like, you know, the biggest thing is like your mileage may vary. Like sometimes upgrades are easy, sometimes aren't. But like, if you can go like, you know, looking back at the talk I just did with like talking about like the typical workflow, and you had like those 4 buckets, right? So that doesn't mean that you have to do all of it, all of 1, and then all of 2, and then all of 3. So like, here's an example, right? Like maybe you have 30 projects in a solution, but like some of them are probably test projects, which obviously you'll need to upgrade at some point, right? But like, focus on the functionality that you know you can reuse and start to figure out ways to reuse it. Like I like this idea of like building reusable islands, right? Like I've used this phrase a few times. Other people have used this phrase where it's like take the code that you don't think is reusable, but it actually is, and put it somewhere where it becomes reusable. Like when we, you know, Khalid, you and I are of a similar age. So like we built like web forms apps, and like everything was in the ASPX file, hitting the database, you know, writing to files, everything was in like ASPX, right? Like, but does it have to be? No. Should it be? Definitely no. So like, you know, the number one strategy that I give to folks is build that inventory of what actually will need to happen to do an upgrade. And when I mean upgrade, I just mean choose a project maybe to start. If you have a lot of projects in your solution, if it's your entire solution, it's like, I have to do it all at once. Like that's a bummer, but you know, compartmentalize it. If you do the inventory, you got a list of all the NuGet packages that are outdated. Maybe you need to go and do a little bit of research. Like maybe some of these NuGet packages aren't like .NET, like modern .NET. Maybe some of them don't even do anything that I want anymore. Like one of the things that I've talked with people about is like when they go through the inventory exercise, they realize they have so many things in their code, whether they're dependencies or areas of code they don't even need anymore. They don't use. Like, you know, that's one of the things that's great about like, you know, tools like ReSharper. It's like find code that like doesn't get touched anymore. Like those sort of things are super valuable. And like, you'll never go through the exercise unless you actually are mindful enough to do it. So going through an upgrade is an opportunity. It's like code cleanup too, right? I'm not trying to add more things to your plate, but like, say for instance, you have a class file that has 800 lines in it, but like only like 300 are actually used. Hey, like reusing that file just became substantially easier, right?
Yep, for sure, for sure. I'm seeing a lot of folks in chat saying things like, "I'm part of the 150 project club." I'll tell folks I've seen solutions with like 1,000+ projects.
Yeah.
So,
isn't like the Chromium project doesn't it have like an absurd amount? Like it's got like hundreds, if not thousands of projects, right?
Yeah.
And like,
I'm talking about .NET though. Specifically, I've seen .NET solutions with 1,000 projects, and they scare me. But those people are legends.
And I think at the end of the day, like the big thing to call out too is like you mentioned, like this idea of like monoliths and microservices, and like we're in this world right now where it's like if everything is in one solution, you're doing it wrong. And my opinion is like no one should ever be telling someone they're doing something wrong. if it's solving a particular business problem a particular way. Like maybe you need to ship your entire app at once just because that's just the way it works. I think what people really don't pick up when they hear about like the microservice approach is like, you want to be modular. You don't want to like have to do everything in one place or everything, all deployment in one place. Like if I change a shopping cart widget, like I don't need to update like the user management page, right? So that's the big thing to talk about. It's like when we're building apps and we're upgrading apps, like maybe you take a step back, it's like, is this app doing what I want it to do in the way I want it to do? If your CI build takes like 3 hours because you're build all those projects, like there's opportunity to improve there, right? So like, you know, modernize, you know, there's like people use the term update or upgrade. I use that term, but like I like using the phrase modernize too, because your code base can stay the exact same, but you can have a more modern approach to things. Like you can take advantage of some DevOps principles. You can use Git flow for as it pertains to like managing like, you know, new features and bug fixes and things like that. And that's not code at all. And those are things that just, they're subtle changes to maybe some tools and maybe some subtle changes into how your teams are put together and how your teams operate. And that'll save you a lot in the long run. But like our 100+ you know, project friends, like there are ways that your app can probably be better and make it a bit easier for you. But the most important thing to call out is that you don't have to go to .NET 8. If you're on .NET 4.8, you're good to go and you have support. And you can focus on the things that matter to you personally, bringing value to yourself and value to the company that you work for.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. I mean, you know, the thing that you said about get your team right, kind of set up your strategy. It kind of reminds me of like cooks and mise en plots where they get like everything out on the table before they start cooking, right?
Yeah.
So it's very much kind of that description from what you were just saying. I do see a lot of people, I don't think they're into Netflix murder shows. I think they're talking about a particular strategy to upgrading, also known as the strangler pattern.
Sure.
Is that a strategy you would recommend for folks maybe upgrading ASP.NET web applications?
So the problem with any opinionated approach to doing things is not going to work for everybody. So personally, the idea of the strangler pattern is interesting to me because like the idea of like, oh, I need to fix this part of code. This is also an opportunity to upgrade to, right? But there are apps today that exist that the only time you ever touch them is when like a bug happens, and it's not a lot of times. And like the interesting thing about the strangler pattern, at least for me, is that it's the incremental replacement thing is definitely key. But you need to understand too is that the incremental pattern when you're switching from like .NET Framework to .NET 8, like the incremental steps is like using .NET Standard, right? Or so like, you know, when I was talking about like the islands approach, where it's like, okay, so like maybe you have 30 projects in your solution, you know, create a class library or a handful of class libraries where it's just like, you know, using the strangler pattern, I guess is like just ripping stuff out, putting it somewhere else, ripping stuff out, putting it somewhere else. I don't know. I mean, my opinion, which again is my opinion and everybody's entitled to their own, is that do whatever you think is going to be best for your team. Like, because you might have folks in your team that like don't like working that way, right? Because there are some approaches to how folks build solutions and manage that sort of technical debt, like strangler pattern. Like for instance, like somebody might not be okay with it. They might get anxiety with that approach, right? So it's really, really important to think about that too. Like, I think what would be worse than upgrading an app and struggling through upgrading an app is working with somebody who is upgraded, who is frustrated updating that app, right? Yeah. I think we've all been there, right? Where we're so frustrated we can't do anything. And then we look over and there's somebody who's more frustrated than us. And you're like, oh, I'm glad I'm not that guy or gal, right? Like, so like you don't want to be in that position. So like, I think the big thing is like, these are things that your teams can have discussions about. Like, oh, we're looking to upgrade our apps. Like there are a handful of well-documented patterns. Like, You know, I think the strangler pattern has always been interesting to me because I can't remember who like came up with it. Probably like someone like Martin Fowler or someone like that, somebody who's a genius.
Yeah.
And you know, because you're a genius, there tends to be this thing in this industry where it's okay, like everybody has to do it this particular way. And don't get me wrong, that might work for a lot of use cases, but there's some use cases that might just not work for. So it's important for us as developers and technologists to determine like what's going to be the best fit, like what implementation, which tool is going to be the best fit for our team. Because otherwise, like it's going to be just as painful as doing it ourselves.
Yeah, I really love that philosophy. I mean, for you saying that, like, is excellent to me because, again, it's like we can all kind of get caught up in patterns and practices and strategies and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, we're all human and we all need to kind of work to our capacity and our skill sets. So I really appreciate you saying just anything in that same vein.
It's funny because I'm looking in the chat and like, you know, like there's some folks that are like throwing out like modular monoliths, which are like right now, like the current thing like people are talking about, right? Where it's like, oh, we don't want to like completely break up our monolith. We want to be able to be a bit more iterative, which I think is great, right? It's just funny that like these things kind of catch up and people are like, this is the thing that we all must do because it's substantially less challenging than this thing. Like 2 or 3 years ago, like you're in this industry, everybody's like Kubernetes all the way up, like just do Kubernetes everywhere and life is great. And then people realize like, I don't want to like manage infrastructure and all of these things. Like, can I just write an app again? So we're kind of circling back to like, what's the best way to get an app to where I want without like having to learn completely new tech every 6 months.
Yep. So on that note, I think this is a good place to kind of wrap up. Again, thank you, Isaac. This is awesome. I think the chat was super excited. Congratulations to the winner of the JetBrains license. Remember to reach out to Isaac.
And I wrote your name down. So if you randomly DM me on Twitter, I'm gonna be like, you're not the person. Sorry.
So, all right, let's wrap up with the end slides here. And then, it says IntelliJ IDEA. No, this is a writer webinar, but IntelliJ IDEA is also a good product. But if you want to know more about JetBrains Writer, Isaac demoed Fleet today, so you can also check that out. Just head on over to jetbrains.com. If you want to read some of our .NET content written by our .NET advocates here at JetBrains, you can head over to our blog, blog.jetbrains.com /writer. And then if you want to follow us on X, you can do that as well. On YouTube, JetBrains TV. If you want to hear more from Isaac, head on over to his website, isaac.levin.com, or you could follow him on YouTube or on X as well. On that note, if you enjoyed this content, please give us a like. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell. You'll see any new content that is uploaded to JetBrains TV, and it's usually good stuff. So on that note, thanks everybody for joining us today, and we'll see you at the next live stream. Bye.